Welcome to Real Life Fiction Stories, and thank you for joining me. Why don't you come in close? Because tonight, I have a real honest-to-goodness true story that you can look up for yourself. A story about a knight who seems to exemplify all the opposite traits you would associate with a knight. A knight who slaughters children, summons demons, and quests for self-wealth. A serial killer in shining armor who some say made a deal with the devil himself. The young boy was cold despite the warm August evening of 1440, and the castle's fireplace fully ablaze. "Would you care for more hippocras, my dear boy?" The child looked at his goblet still half full, and swirled the mixture of wine and spices, and a strong smell of cinnamon arose from the vessel. "Thank you, my lord," he said nervously, not wanting to be rude, and downed what was left before offering his cup to the knight who stood before him. "My dear boy, your hand it trembles something fierce. Pray tell, does the castle draft bite at your bones?" Before the young boy could reply, Gilles de Rais had turned to his bodyguard, Etienne Gorillo, also known as Poitou, and solicited his attention. "Poitou, my new page has a chill. Where is that doublet I had made for him?" Poitou smiled and bowed, before turning around to the wardrobe and pulling out the finest coat the boy had ever seen in his life. "Try it on, my dear boy. I think you'll find it as near to custom fit as possible without having it been measured." The knight was right. The coat fit the boy perfectly. "I trust you find yourself more comfortable, my dear boy?" Gilles asked, and the words and drink swirled inside of the boy's head as he began to feel the alcohol take effect. "Oui, much better," he said with a genuine smile, and gulping down a large swallow of his drink. "Very good. Perhaps it is time for my page to have access to what those only in my innermost circle have access to. What do you think, Poitou?" "Oui, I believe he is ready," Poitou said gleefully. Gilles turned back to the boy. "What say you, dear boy? Are you ready?" "Oui, my lord. I am ready." Gilles' smile split his face from ear to ear. "Very good, dear boy. Take my hand." The young boy set down his goblet and took Gilles' hand, and was led into the hallway up into the castle's tower. The two men and child reached the door to the room that not just anyone was allowed into. A room whose walls, if could talk, would surely be nothing more than the shrieks of terror and pain from victims past. Gilles reached his hand to the door and turned to look at the boy, and smiled the same face-splitting smile. The boy looked up and beamed a childish joy back at him. Gilles slowly began to push the heavy door open, never taking his eyes off of the child. He watched the boy as he stared into the room, gazed at him as the boy's smile melted into shock and terror. The child beheld an empty room, save for hooks hanging from the ceiling, and a large broad sword in the corner, and the smell of blood. The young boy backed away instinctively, but was met by a solid figure behind him, which suddenly had closed around him, preventing him from moving. Poitou had lifted the child, binding him and stripping him before hanging him on one of the hooks, while the boy wept. Gilles stripped and began to fondle the boy while pleasuring himself, finally raping the boy. When he had finished, he took the child down and began to soothe and reassure him. Now, my dear boy, don't cry. I only wanted to play with you. Don't you want to play with me?" The boy only continued to weep. "Don't you want to play with me?" Gilles yelled at the child. "Oui," the boy managed to choke out. Gilles began to laugh giddily as he sprung himself up from off of the floor next to the boy. "Excellent!" he exclaimed before reaching over to the heavy broadsword in the corner and letting its weight arc itself across the boy's neck, nearly severing his head. Gilles sat on top of the boy as he lay on his back, clutching his neck, slowly dying, Gilles laughing all the while. As the whites of the child's eyes rolled up and his struggles ceased, Gilles turned to his bodyguard at the door. "You know what to do, Poitou," Gilles huffed out of breath. Poitou had done this next part many times, if not him, then Henriette, Gilles' other bodyguard, in the know, and it didn't matter if he had been the one to kill the kids, or Gilles. This part was always the same. He began to separate the boy into pieces, and throughout the next few hours a small portion of the body and clothing would be burned, along with a generous portion of wood so as to minimize its smell. With that complete, he would take the ashes and scatter them either in the cesspit, the moat, or somewhere along the grounds where people were scarce. Éoné de Villeblanche and his wife Massy would never be able to lay their son's body to rest. Gilles lay on his bed, secure behind the walls of his Château de Defarge, perched on its hill, but nevertheless wore the expression of a man deeply concerned. He had not been thinking about the boy, but rather his decision to kidnap and murder the priest 3 months earlier on May 14th, 1440. The priest had been Jean Le Ferron, who was the brother of his enemy, Geoffrey Le Ferron, whom he had quarreled with over a land dispute. Naturally, the disappearance of a priest had alerted the church, and the Bishop of Nantes had launched an investigation. The bishop had supposedly enough evidence of murder, sodomy, and heresy to bring forward last month on July 29th, that the secular courts had begun their own investigation. Gilles stared at the ceiling unblinking. He did not think his secret could last much longer. 1 month later, on September 15th, 1440, Gilles, Poitou, and Henriette had been arrested. Gilles was most likely born in late 1405 in his family's castle, Champtocé-sur-Loire. His parents died when he was only 10 years old in 1415. 5 years later, he was betrothed by his grandfather to Catherine de Thouars of Brittany, and the two were married in 1420. Their only child, Marie, would be born between 1433 and 1434. From 1427 to 1435, Gilles served in the Royal Army, and just 11 years prior to his arrest in 1429, he had fought alongside Joan of Arc, and after her execution was appointed to the Marshal of France. He had been heir to a large estate and noble lineage. He was a knight of France, but he was terrible with money. By 1435, Gilles had withdrawn from the military and public life, and he had squandered most of his inheritance selling off his land to support his extravagant lifestyle and private plays consisting of over 400 extras and costumes used for only one performance before being disposed of at the end of each show. On July 2nd, 1435, family members of Gilles appealed to King Charles VII about Gilles' spending, and a royal edict was declared barring any subjects of the king's to enter into any contract with him, as well as bar all sales of his property in an attempt to save what was left of his family's wealth. It was around this time rumors began swirling around France and Gilles' dabblings with the occult. At Gilles' trial, priest Eustace Blancet gave testimony that he was sent to find those in knowledge of alchemy, finding one called Fontenelle, a local magician. Gilles had begun to practice alchemy in an attempt to continue his lavish living, but was disappointed with its results, or rather lack thereof. This had supposedly prompted Gilles to seek out other means of acquiring wealth. It was testified he had sought out another magician/cleric, François Perty, who had told him the summoning of demons to do his bidding would assure his wealth. Like his practice in alchemy, however, his attempts were unsuccessful. Gilles returned to Perty, who informed the knight that the demons demand the blood and limbs of children before manifesting, and some say the devil himself demanded his allegiance before giving in to his demands. Not all of the murders Gilles committed in his life were for satanic favor, however, and Gilles would have seemed to have had no qualms with his task, as per his confession, he had already begun his assault on children between the spring of 1432 and the spring of 1433. Even before this, however, the dark nature of Gilles had supposedly already been seen lurking just below the surface. When Etienne Corillo, also known as Poitou, Gilles' bodyguard and accomplice, had been a boy living on the street, Gilles had lured him into his chateau where he was raped and about to have his throat slit, when it was remarked to Gilles that the boy would make a fine page. Poitou's life was spared. During the trial, Gilles would give his confession in which he would state, "When the children were dead, I would kiss them, and those who had the most handsome limbs and heads, I would hold up to admire them, and have their bodies cut open and delight in the sight of their inner organs. Very often, when the children were dying, I would sit on their stomachs and take pleasure in seeing them die and laugh." The confession and details of the murders, however, had only come about after the threat of severe torture. On October 21st, 1440, after the testimony of 110 witnesses, hundreds of complaints of peasants whose children had last been seen begging at Gilles' castle for food, and the confession of Gilles, Poitou, and Henriette had been given to the court cancelled the plan of torture for confession. The court transcript includes the testimony of the parents of missing children, as well as descriptions of the murders provided by Gilles' accomplices, some of which are said to have been so heinous to contemplate, the judge ordered them stricken from the record. It is speculated that Gilles had killed between 100 to as many as 600 children, mostly boys between 6 and 18, having blonde hair and blue eyes. On October 23, 1440, the court heard the official confessions of Poitou and Henriette and sentenced them to death. 2 days later, on October 25, 1440, Gilles gave his confession and subsequently was also sentenced to death. The execution would take place the following day on Wednesday, October 26, 1440, and at 9 a.m. that morning, they were moved to the Isle des Bayous to be hanged and burned. At 11 a.m., the tinder below the gallows was set alight, and Gilles was the first to be dropped, the rope snapping his neck as the flames licked at his boots. His body had been allowed to be claimed by 4 ladies of high rank before the fire could consume his body, and his request to be buried in the church of the monastery of Notre-Dame-des-Carmes in Nantes was granted. He was 36 years old. 562 years later, there are still those who maintain the murders never occurred, and that Gilles was a victim of politics and corruption, forced to give a false confession under threat of torture. Whether or not this is true is still under debate, however. Perhaps one day history will describe Gilles as the victim, or perhaps his reputation is well deserved, and will stand as a monument to the evils of men.